Ukraine is in a very challenging position, and in fact, they're probably really more at a fork in the road right now. Russia is continuing its offensive, and they're continuing to make progress while Ukraine is running out of both troops and equipment. The election in the United States is coming up, and that could dictate what U.S. aid looks like for Ukraine in the very near future and longer term, and there's fatigue starting to set in within Europe. Russia is also managing to sustain its offensive and its invasion with partnerships with both Iran and North Korea, and this is spelling trouble for Ukraine because not only is Russia just simply bigger than Ukraine and has more resources, it's also getting more support from its allies than Ukraine has been getting. That being said, they have way less allies and their allies can offer less capabilities, so really what you see in Ukraine is different, but they're getting actual troops on the ground, it would seem right now, whereas Ukraine is not getting that at all. And this takes us to a speech that Zelenskyy gave in Brussels very recently, which indicates that he views that Ukraine right now has really two options towards peace. One is towards a military alliance that will guarantee Ukrainian security. We've actually already talked about this in a past video. I'll have that linked down in the video description. And the other is potentially a nuclear weapon. On the alliance, just a broad overview on that. The discussions with Ukraine have basically been with joining NATO. Now, within NATO, Ukraine would need unanimous support within NATO to be able to join. They also would need to not be involved in a war. I've seen President Biden talk about making an exception, but to be honest with you, everything that I see coming out of NATO indicates to me that it's just going to be window dressing. It's going to be trying to make Ukraine feel better, but they're not going to be letting them into the alliance anytime soon. Of course, Ukraine could pursue a new, fresh alliance with bilateral agreements with different countries, or just something outside of NATO that could guarantee its security. However, at this point, I haven't seen anything on that. Now, I did mention that alternative was nuclear weapons, and this comes with some benefits and risks, and that's what I want to talk about in this video. And I also want to talk about why this may be the preferred path given Ukraine's history. So let's unpack this a lot further. Let's talk about, should Ukraine pursue a nuclear weapons program and do so to end the war? What would that even look like? Why is it that Ukraine's history might actually favor this course of action over an alliance? And what are some of the benefits of having nuclear weapons, and what are some of the risks of Ukraine having nuclear weapons? And I also want to mention that I've already posted an article on Medium talking about this. I've actually started writing on Medium recently, because I like writing. It's just like a fun little place to kind of augment the content that I'm making on this platform. So if you're interested in that, check that out. I'll be posting for both Medium members, so you'll have to pay the Medium membership to access some of those articles, but that really helps not only me as a writer, that also helps other writers that you read on the platform as well. There's plenty of great articles on there, but I'll also have this article as well that I wrote on this topic is free for everybody. So you can check that out. Check out my page on Medium and drop a little subscribe for me. That would be awesome. Now let's talk about the history and why the history kind of favors the pursuit of nuclear weapons for Ukraine. Ukraine inherited originally one of the world's largest nuclear stockpiles following the end of the Soviet Union. And this became a huge negotiating point between the United States, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and the Soviet Union following the end of the Cold War, because the Soviet Union wanted its nukes back. The United States wanted the Soviets to have their nukes back. They didn't want just, all these countries that suddenly have these massive stockpiles, and the countries themselves weren't necessarily equipped to sustain these nuclear weapons themselves. So it was kind of a mutually agreed upon thing. In 1994, they all met in Budapest and created the Budapest Memorandum. This was an agreement, again, of course, those countries, Ukraine obviously included in that, were Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan surrendered their nuclear weapons stockpiles to Russia. In doing so, they received security guarantees between both the United States and Russia that their security and their national sovereignty would be respected, and that in the case of any breach by either party, then the other party would be obligated to come in into their defense. Now, we see immediately or very quickly after that this is not being honored. Of course, Russia goes through some changes between 1994 and 2004. You have a change in leadership where Vladimir Putin comes in, then Russia kind of takes up a more aggressive foreign policy. In 2004, Ukraine entered a crisis that was later named the Orange Revolution. And this is basically where an election occurred that the Ukrainian people saw as corrupt and that outside monitors saw as corrupt. There was a lot of voter intimidation, a lot of problems with the way that election was run. And of course, at the end of the election, election, the pro-Russian candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, won over pro-European Union candidate, Viktor Yushchenko. Now, a lot of protests took place because of the conduct of this election, and that led to a second round of votes. And the second election was, of course, observed by international monitors, and they determined that this indeed was a free and fair election, the second time around. And then in that second election, Viktor Yushchenko won. Now, at the end of his term, Viktor Yushchenko would lose again to Viktor Yanukovych in 2010. And, of course, Ukraine would kind of switch again from more of a pro-Europe policy and economic direction towards a pro-Russia direction. Now, the tensions in Ukraine didn't go away. They continued to build here. And under Yanukovych, things really weren't going too well. Prices continued to skyrocket. He did try to appease the pro-EU crowd by pursuing EU membership. However, the Ukrainian people believe that he was really slow-rolling negotiations to join the EU, really in favor of joining a kind of a competitor economic union that Russia was facilitating at the time. And the people did not like that. They did not want to join the Russian Economic Forum. They wanted to join the European Union. And so they felt that what Yanukovych was doing was not in good faith, and it was not what the people were voting for. And so that led to a series of protests in the Maidan Square that later became known as the Maidan Revolution, or as what many Ukrainians refer to it as the Revolution of Dignity. And of course, this is a very huge moment in Ukrainian history, in modern Ukrainian history, where these protests turned violent eventually. You have police shooting at protesters. The whole thing kind of goes up in smoke. And after a few days of protests and clashes, Yanukovych flees. And he doesn't even inform parliament that he's leaving. And then he later crops up in Russia. And so they hold a whole new round of elections in Ukraine, and then they voted in a pro-European Union leader, and things begin to switch over from there. Now, Russia takes advantage of this whole situation, and they annex Crimea with little green men. And I'm sure you're starting to become, you're seeing where we are in history now, because this is starting to become a bit more familiar. The conflict in Donbass begins. Russia not only annexes Crimea, they also push troops into Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, and the fighting really starts to kick up there. Now, this leads to the Minsk Agreement, where Ukraine met with Russia and facilitated by Britain and France, and they come up with what was remembered as the Minsk I Agreement. This is the first Minsk Agreement. It was a ceasefire to attempt to stop the fighting. Now, this ultimately failed because, of course, Russia rotated fresh troops into the Donbass and started a new offensive, delivered a pretty decisive defeat on Ukrainian forces there at the time, and then they pursued the Minsk II Agreement, which was even more lopsided against Ukraine, but not all of the ceasefire amendments for this agreement were implemented. The fighting kind of continued at a very low-level pace, for years following. And this marks the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is why you'll hear, if you haven't heard this yet, a lot of Ukrainians will refer to this war as really being years old, and the full-scale invasion was just an escalation in the war. It really started in 2014. Now, after 2014, while all this is going on, Ukraine is pursuing, their own military alliances with Western countries because they see that Russia is not honoring their role in the Budapest Memorandum. They gave up nuclear weapons, and instead of, securing their borders and allowing Ukraine to exist, Russia is starting to dig into Ukrainian territory and take over parts of Ukraine for themselves. So they start pushing for Western support. They start receiving some training from Western allies. They start, kind of overhauling parts of their military. And then we see over years, by the time that, tension started to kick back up in 2021 and then again in start of 2022, the Ukrainian military looked very different from the military that Russia had encountered back in 2014. And of course, you'll remember that on February 24th, 2024, Vladimir Putin initiated what he described as a special military operation. It was supposed to take 2 weeks in his mind to flip the Ukrainian government back into a pro-Russian stance. Of course, that didn't exactly play out that way. 2.5, almost 3 years later, the war continues to rage on. This war has been incredibly costly, not just for Russia. We've talked a lot about Russian losses. Obviously, it's been incredibly costly for Ukraine. And that takes us to where we are today with Ukraine's current situation. Of course, Western aid continues to flow into Ukraine, but there's a lot of uncertainty about what that aid's going to look like longer term. The elections coming up here in the United States, it's going to hit on November 5th. Now, all eyes are on who wins this election in the United States, because the assumption is that if one candidate wins, then Ukraine will continue to receive the current level of aid, and if the other candidate wins, then Ukraine will not receive any aid. Personally, I'm not quite sure that that will be the case, but we'll just have to wait and see. But that uncertainty is certainly, casting a shadow over this conflict and over Ukraine here. There's also a lot of fatigue within Europe, especially within Germany, which has provided a lot of aid to Ukraine so far in this war, but certainly could be doing a little bit more, but that's just an opinion. The fatigue within Europe is starting to set in on, okay, when's this war going to end? How much longer do we need to support Ukraine here? When do we need to start ramping up our own military spending? And that's becoming a bit of an issue. On the flip side, Russia is receiving even more support from its allies than ever before. Of course, Iran has been providing ballistic missiles. We know, especially from other videos on my channel that we've talked about how Iran has problems of their own. So Russia is starting to receive support from other countries like North Korea, for instance. And it appears North Korea is sending ground troops to Russia as well to assist with this war. So there's really kind of a growing issue where the support for Ukraine may start to dwindle here very soon, and support for Russia is kind of kicking up within their alliance network. And so that's not really spelling good news for Ukraine medium to longer term. And that, of course, takes us to Zelensky's speech in Brussels recently, where he talked about his peace plan and how it's either going to take an alliance that will assure, Ukrainian security from Russia in the future, or it's going to have to be nuclear weapons. And he later backtracked and said that, Ukraine's not going to pursue a nuclear weapons program. I'll talk about why that might be here in just a moment. But he really kind of spelled all of this out in his speech that we just talked about. He highlighted how Ukraine has suffered since denuclearization. He suggested the need for either an alliance or a nuclear weapon to rectify this suffering. Now, there are obviously challenges to NATO membership. We've already talked about that. Aside from the challenges that we've already discussed with NATO, Putin's already been very clear that that is a red line for Russia, for Ukraine, and with NATO. We've seen a lot of red lines from Putin already in this war, not just on Ukraine and NATO, but on other items. And we've seen those red lines be crossed and nothing really happened. So take that for what you will, but it's still something to observe. Pending an alliance, if NATO's not going to allow Ukraine could pursue alliances with other countries, especially those in Eastern Europe like Poland or some other countries that may not necessarily favor Russia and be, fearful of Russian intervention and might want to, band together. If NATO's not going to take care of them, then they'll take care of themselves. That might be one idea, but again, I haven't seen any movement on that yet. Now, on the flip side, if they can't secure an alliance network, Zelenskyy kind of indicated that a nuclear weapons program might be the path forward. And I think that this might be a potentially simpler and more potent option for Ukraine. They already have a civilian nuclear energy program, and so that makes it a lot easier for them to transition that program into a military nuclear program if needed. Now, I talked about this in a little bit more detail in the article on Medium, but there is kind of a historical example of nuclear weapons and conflicts. And I talk about the concept of there are the haves and there are the have-nots. There are those that have nuclear weapons and there are those that don't. And there's a difference historically, especially in the past century, on what happens to countries that have versus do not have. Check out that article for a little bit more of a deep dive on that. But taking that concept, Ukraine is currently dealing with the impact of being a have-not country. They were a have country before the Budapest Memorandum, but after the memorandum, remember, they surrendered their nuclear weapons stockpile back to Russia. So then they became a have-not country. And as a result, we're seeing, they're being invaded. They've, for decades, at least 2 decades here, they've been, the subject of Russian interference. And so that's something that obviously they can't really tolerate any further. And they're trying to fight back, but with the size of Russia and this, how this war has gone so far, they may just have to take matters into their own hands if Western countries aren't going to give them the support that they need to actually win the war. Now, with all that being said, the potential strategy here for Ukraine would be to leverage their civilian nuclear program to secretly produce nuclear weapons. And the reason I say secretly, we'll talk about here in a second, but once they produce nuclear weapons, they won't use them. They'll just announce that they have them and then use that announcement as a bargaining chip for ceasefire negotiations with Russia. Now, this can kind of go one of two ways. We're going to talk about the risks here in a minute as well, but this can negate Russia's nuclear dominance in a way over Ukraine. Yes, Russia has bigger bombs. They have way more of them. But if, Vladimir Putin realizes that the risk of nuclear escalation is not just that the United States would come back or another nuclear power would come back at Russia, it's that Ukraine would strike back. And of course, Ukraine would be more willing to strike back at Russia than anybody else. That will factor into his risk calculus and kind of his decision-making process. And all of this might, of course, help, expedite a negotiated ceasefire and an end to this conflict. Now, here are some challenges to producing nuclear weapons for Ukraine. Obviously, I talked about how they would need to do this in secret. secret. And I think that this is kind of why Zelenskyy might have backtracked from his original statement in Brussels about developing nuclear weapons. You don't want to just let your enemy know, hey, we're producing nuclear weapons. That's really something you want to announce and say, hey, I have them now, and there's nothing you can do to stop me from producing more because I already have some of them. If they know that you're producing some, then they'll start disrupting, killing scientists. We've seen what happens in Iran whenever there's kind of an open secret on a nuclear weapons program. And we've seen Ukraine, of course, succeed in operational security in the past. Now, I will say that there are some risks here. Of course, it's difficult to produce anything secretly, especially nuclear weapons. And I would imagine that Russian intelligence is really monitoring, if anything, this about as close as anything. And so the loss of secrecy could lead to some pretty significant escalation, because Russia might interpret that as, okay, it's not a guarantee that Ukraine's not going to use a bomb. And so what does that mean for the war? And so because of that, Russia may act desperately to prevent nuclear weapons development for Ukraine. Now, of course, developing nuclear weapons also increases the stakes of this conflict. It's not just about, losing key leadership and millions of civilians. It's the threat to the habitability of entire cities. And somehow, Zelensky's going to have to demonstrate a willingness to use these weapons at, the worst case scenario without actually using them. I mean, that's kind of where deterrence comes in. It's not a deterrent if you're not showing that you're actually willing to use it. And so how do you kind of balance willing to use a nuclear weapon without using a nuclear weapon, especially whenever the fact that you even have a nuclear weapon is itself a surprise? This, of course, puts both Russian and Ukrainian cities at risk, but it also puts the rest of Europe at risk with radiation and stuff. So it really impacts a lot of people here, and I don't think anybody would be terribly thrilled at Ukraine having nuclear weapons. But to me, I would see that as a consequence of, look, nobody wanted to, buck up and defend Ukraine. And so Ukraine's taking matters into their own hands. Not necessarily saying that I'm a fan of this scenario. I'm just kind of, we're war gaming this scenario here. Now, of course, that leads us to the international, implications here. It breaks a taboo around nuclear energy and weapons. And I think that this may incentivize other countries that may have their own security challenges that they're looking at to develop their own nuclear weapon programs. And there are other countries around the world that have civilian nuclear energy programs that could quickly transition from just a civilian program to a military program as well. I think that we're likely to see some Western powers like the United States strongly discourage Ukraine from its nuclear aims. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Again, it really escalates the stakes of this conflict. And it impacts more than just Ukraine. This has global implications here. Western powers will probably discourage this from happening. But at the same time, if Ukraine might just be thinking, we've got to think for ourselves because no one's coming. And so that takes us to Ukraine's dilemma. They need security guarantees or an alliance of some sort, or they'll need another kind of weapon to guarantee their own sovereignty. And nuclear weapons are really the only other example that might succeed in securing their sovereignty. We've talked about a lot of the risks. There's a lot of them. There are some benefits, and that they may actually succeed in ending the war. But the question is, what happens after that? And with that, I want to leave that to you guys. Let's talk about this, in the comments. Let's continue this conversation. Check out the article on Medium if you found this to be interesting. And of course, like this video if you found it helpful or informative, and subscribe to this channel for more content in the future. With all that, I'll see y'all next time. Later.